Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fresh, your host. You're listening to LibertyRadioLive.com. Thanks for tuning in this morning. It's my pleasure to be here. This morning on Inquisition Update, we're going to take an appropriate and timely intermission from our reading and discussion of the book, The Vatican Billions by Avril Manhattan, a book in which we have learned, among many other things, that the Roman Catholic Church is, above all, the church of mammon, the church of money, and that the wealthiest order of the Roman Catholic Church is the Jesuit order, which Avril Manhattan says owns 51% of the stock of the Bank of America, and which F. Tupper Saucy, in his book, Rulers of Evil, implies that the Jesuits ultimately own the Federal Reserve Bank, to which our entire national debt is owed. This morning, my guest is Ken Bitchute of Tamaki Law, the Native American-run law firm who recently won a $166.1 million lawsuit against the Northwest Jesuit province for the sexual abuse of Native American children in Jesuit-run boarding schools and missions. By way of introduction, I'm going to read a few excerpts from a newspaper article dealing with the settlement of the case. The argument states in part, in a settlement that's being called historic, an order of the Roman Catholic priests, the Jesuit order, has agreed to pay $166.1 million to roughly 450 Native Americans who were sexually abused by priests. In the settlement, the Oregon province of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, also agreed to issue written apologies to each victim and produce documentation that the religious order was aware of the abuse. According to the lawsuit, victims suffered sexual abuse at boarding schools run by the religious order in Washington, Idaho, and Montana over a period spanning the 1950s through the 1970s. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, operated St. Mary's Mission and School for more than 60 years. Although the society filed bankruptcy, the richest of the rich Roman Catholic orders, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, filed bankruptcy after being hit with the lawsuits. It will sell off assets to pay only $48.1 million toward the settlement, while, get this, its insurer will pay the remaining $118 million. Here to talk about this case is my special guest, Ken Bitchute of Tamaki Law. Good morning, Ken, and God bless you for coming this morning, and please inform my listeners about these Jesuit atrocities.
Yes, good morning, Tom. You know, I've been in this for a little over 3 years. The abuses that occurred at the Indian missions run by the Jesuits are, you know, you can't even fathom how long this went on and how many victims there were. You know, there were 300 that came forward in a short period of time. What happened was we filed a lawsuit against the Jesuits in October 2009, and they filed for bankruptcy protection in February of 2010, 4 months after we filed the lawsuit against them. They tried everything they could do to get a dismissal of our lawsuit. They couldn't do that. They didn't want to face our plaintiffs in open court. They filed bankruptcy protection. And then from that point on, we were kind of just like going about doing our business, doing a little advertising here and there. And then in August, the Judge Ferris, who was hearing this case in the federal bankruptcy court in Portland, Oregon, because that's where the Jesuits are headquartered, said that we had a cutoff date of November 30th to get out there and inform the public, Native American communities, about this deadline of November 30th. So we had just this 3-month period to get out there and really start communicating. And it was an education process, because the victims of childhood sexual abuse, some may remember that they were victims of abuse. Others have tried desperately to block this out, never remember it, to not think about it, to train themselves. Anytime that anything comes up like that, they turn away. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to see it. And what we had to educate them about was, if you were a victim of childhood sexual abuse and you suffer from depression, anxiety, panic attacks, night terrors, nightmares, alcoholism, drug abuse, all of these things that are trauma traits of sexual abuse victims, if you suffer from these and you are a victim of childhood sexual abuse, you're entitled to damages, and you need to call us. And so by getting out there, and just myself in Native American, I was able to integrate into all of the tribal communities in Washington, Idaho, and Montana, and really get in there on the grassroots among those people and talk to them, let them know what I'm doing and what this is about, and then leave my cards or a flyer or whatever needed to be done. And I would start getting calls. I'd go back, and I can tell you about one incident. Was on the Colville Reservation. I was there in Omak. I had a list of about 18 people that had called. I went back to the reservation. I live on the Yakima Reservation in Yakima, Washington. And I went over to the Colville Reservation, and for a 3-day period, I was there, was interviewing victims of abuse. And this was the first time that I had a list like this of 18. And only 14 showed up. There were 4 that kind of held back. And that was pretty normal. On that first time out, people think that they can just go out and talk about it and tell what happened. But it doesn't work that way. This is a very personal experience, very traumatic. The majority have never told anyone before. And so they'll drop back and hold out for a while they build up their courage to do this. So I was interviewing these 14 people, one after the other. And then I had one in Bridgeport, Washington, as I was going home. And so I stopped there, and I saw this woman, very small, slight woman, in her mid-40s, who had been abused in the early 1970s. We started talking and kind of introducing ourselves to one another. This is the Indian way. We talk about little things as we come to know who we are and where you're from, all of that. And then we started talking, and I just said, well, just tell me what happened. And she started talking, and I could just see and feel the pain that this woman went through, being digitally penetrated by Father Morris, who was the head of the St. Mary's Indian Mission School in Omak, Washington, for a period of 1.5 years, to the point of actual rape. And it was so visceral, what she was telling me about and what she was re-experiencing and going through at that moment. It was heartbreaking. And I remember after I left, I had my daughter with me on that trip. And I got in the car. I drove about 1.5 blocks. I pulled over, and I just broke down and cried.
Yeah.
It was just...
Listen, Ken, I can understand the emotional component of this thing. What I describe this as a global pedophile priest pandemic around the world. This isn't unique to the Northwest Jesuit province. And I view the 3-month limitation, the deadline set by the judge, as an obvious obstruction to your investigation. Is that the way you see it?
Oh yeah, definitely it was. I mean, we should have had, 6 months or even longer, because, bringing in, actually there were only 200 victims. They say 300, but there were only 200 victims of sexual abuse that came forward in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. The other 50 were physical abuse victims that they suspected that was psychosexual abuse without actual, I guess, the normal acts of sexual abuse. These were psychosexual that came through, and so they're not really counted as full-out sexual abuse plans. Anyway, yes, it was. I mean, we already know that there's a period called future claims that will come after this is settled in August or September. Funds are distributed from the settlement. There are people that never came forward, and they're called future claimants. And we know that there are so many of them out there that are going to be coming forward after this period. But what is happening is that the Jesuits and the court, out of this $166.1 million, is only going to put about $6.8 million aside for these future claimants. Yeah. And I don't see that as being nearly enough,
No, obviously not. And what's striking to me, Ken, is that Ireland just finished a decade-long investigation into priest pedophilia in Ireland, and that was the product of a decade of research. And it's appalling to me that the court would set a restriction on the length of time you had to gather information, and clearly an act of obstruction.
And that's what the Jesuit order pushed for. We tried to go around that, try to get them to extend that out, and the influences on Judge Paris were that we need to do this now. This is, we want the bankruptcy. The Jesuits in bankruptcy were really pushing for that, saying that they wanted to resolve this, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why Judge Paris made the decision to go along with that, but that's what she did. There were a lot of things that went on, but I can tell you about just a comment about Ireland. I was in a Minneapolis airport and sitting and talking, and I met this Irish man, and we were sitting there talking, kind of like, well, what will you do, just passing time, because we had so many hours to wait there. We started talking. I started telling him about the Jesuit abuse case, and he was just very interested, and then he told me, this is a comment that he made to me. He said, when he was a kid, this guy's about 60 years old, he said, when I was a kid in Ireland, he said, we didn't talk about this, we never let it. He said, but I can tell you this. He said, I look back on it now, and he said, if you weren't boogered by a priest in Ireland, he said, there was something wrong with you. He said, that's how bad it was. Yeah. It's almost the same thing that happened at Indian Missions.
And some people find it somewhat strange that people wait until their 50s and 60s before they come forward with stories of pedophile priest abuse. But it's not strange at all, given the fact that there's so much stigma attached to sodomy and so much stigma attached to sexual abuse in general, that people have to live with these realities in secret all their lives, usually suffering a drug and alcohol abuse as a way to cope, and then only then in the later years of their life find the courage to come forward and tell their stories. Is this what you find in your investigations?
This is true. It's absolutely true across the board. The majority of the people that finally came forward and asked to be contacted, and I went and visited with them. This is the first time, when I talked to them, it was the first time they had ever told anyone. And I can tell you this, we have one woman who was a client of ours. She's 87 years old, abused in the 1930s by a priest. And she talked to me about witnessing some of her schoolgirl mates that were at St. Mary's Mission, and what was going on and happening to them, and then it eventually happened to her. And when she told her parents, her mother, so ingrained, so indoctrinated into the Catholic faith, called her daughter a liar, wouldn't speak with her. Their relationship after that was strained because she held to saying, this is what happened to me. I don't want to go back. Eventually, her father told her, you don't have to. You don't have to go back. Not saying he believed her, but he just told her she didn't have to go. And so, you know, there's so many stories like this that people did with these children, did try to tell someone, did try to go and get help. And they were just either disbelieved, or even when they were believed, they were told, don't ever say anything, don't ever talk about this. And they would be sent back. And I was asked one time, even these grandparents that had been to this mission, to Lomac at St. Mary's, would send their children back, even though they were victims of abuse. But I can look at that, and, you know, the majority of these people were victimized one at a time, unless there were others that were there at the same time. But they always believe they're the only one. It only happened to me. You know, they don't think that this is going on with the others.
In the research that I've done on the subject, I find that to be a common thing, that people who are victims of priest pedophilia stay quiet because they believe that they're the only ones that have suffered this abuse. And this is why I brought you on the program this morning to show us that just in the Northwest Jesuit province, Oregon, Montana, and Washington, and I believe even Alaska, there were 450 cases. And not only that, the BBC did a documentary that disclosed that there are 4,500 open cases of priest pedophilia in the courts of this country. This is not an isolated incident. There are not just one or two victims of priest pedophilia. This is a global pandemic. It's out of control. And it's not just in the United States. It's in Ireland. It's in Germany. It's in Italy. It's in every Roman Catholic country in the world. And I think it's time for society to put a stop to it.
You know, what I've discovered in my investigations is that these Jesuit Indian missions, there were 4 that operated in Washington, Idaho, and Montana. There was St. Mary's Mission in Colville Reservation. There was Sacred Heart in Idaho at DeSmet. There was St. Ignatius Mission that was located at St. Ignatius, Montana. And there was St. Paul's Mission that was in Hayes, Montana on the Grovine Indian Reservation. These 4 Indian missions, in my research going back to the 1940s, these pedophile priests, they were shifted around to each one of these mission schools and back again. And they would be at St. Mary's Mission 4 or 5 years. They would go to Sacred Heart and be there for 2 or 3 years, and then to St. Ignatius again.
Yeah, that's always been the Jesuit strategy, or the Vatican strategy. When they have a pedophile priest, they simply move him from one diocese to the next to keep them out of trouble. They never put a stop to the pedophilia.
No, and that created this cycle of abuse. I mean, they everywhere they went, they sexually abused children, and so all these priests were going around to all of these Indian missions, and they would abuse and abuse and abuse, and then they get sent somewhere else. And even when they got sent to a non-Indian parish, like Father Ferretti, who was a known pedophile priest, even when he went to a white community, repeated these same patterns of abuse on those little farming communities, those isolated communities, with one parish priest, and he would be the one going around to the homes, visiting with them and making friends, and all the time he's grooming these relationships with the adults while doing that, and he's grooming the children. He would come, and pay such special attention, and the family would be so pleased that, he just loves their little daughter, their little boy. They're just so special. Not realizing that what he's doing in the background, he's groping them, touching them, digitally penetrating them, trying to isolate them away so he could do what he wanted to do. And this was his pattern and practice right up until the time he died.
Yes.
He was an old man, an old grandfather man in his 70s, and he was still doing what he had done for 40 years.
It's taught and believed in the Roman Catholic Church that the priest is the holy man. It is also taught that the priest is the creator of the creator. When he consecrates the host and it becomes the Eucharist, it becomes the blood, body, soul, and divinity of Christ. That little piece of bread becomes Jesus Christ to be worshipped and offered again as a sacrifice on the altar of the Mass. These priests, particularly Jesuit priests, are considered to be godly men. And there's also a teaching in the Roman Catholic Church that a parishioner has no more business bringing a case or a complaint against a priest than a slave has to bring a case against his slave master. That's an official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, and we talk about these things all the time on Inquisition Update. And it's time for the American people to come to grips with Roman Catholicism. What is it really all about, and what is it about the Roman Catholic Church that fosters this environment of rampant pedophilia by the priests of Rome? And people suggest that because they're celibate, that they seek sexual relief, but the fact of the matter is they pick on children because they can intimidate the children. The children are taught to look up to the priests, that they are alter Christos, alter Christ, another Christ, and they're simply threatened with divine retribution if they reveal these secrets. That's why the victims sit on these abuses all of their lives before they die, they muster up the courage to tell the truth about this. And I'm very happy that Tamaki Law Firm has taken the case. I'm particularly happy that Tamaki Law Firm is a Native American organization fighting for justice for Native Americans who have always been regarded by the Roman Catholic Church as less than human. And this needs to stop.
Tom, I can tell you this, these Jesuit priests on these reservations, you take children 5 and 6 years old, you take them away to these Indian missions, and during the 1940s, 50s, and even in the early 60s, this was mandated by law. Of course, they had to go to school. But in many of these Indian reservations, they're very rural communities, far outlying home sites, and they didn't have a regular bus that came out to these schools. So for that reason, they were forced to go to an Indian mission. Now, the Colville Reservation had an Indian mission, which was St. Mary's. The Coeur d'Alene and Lapwai reservations had another mission, and it was a Jesuit mission, Sacred Heart. The same was true on the Flathead Reservation with the St. Ignatius Church and School, and the same thing on the Fort Belknap Indian community that had St. Paul's. They had children that they were there, they were captive, vulnerable children. And at these ages of 5, 6, 7 years old, and they're coming there, they're staying there year-round. Many of them were year-round. They didn't even go home in the summers. And
we're coming
they're
up
indoctrinated.
Returning to my guest, Ken Bitchute from Tamaki Law, the law firm in Washington that successfully prosecuted the Northwest Jesuit province for decades-long sexual abuse of Native American children. The Jesuit order has simply claimed bankruptcy so as to avoid the penalty for their crimes. And to add insult to injury, in complete indifference to the plight of the victims of this Northwest Jesuit province, Jesuit Father Patrick J. Conroy, S.J., has become the new chaplain and spiritual counselor to the members of the United States House of Representatives. Patrick J. Conroy, S.J., is a member of this notorious Northwest Jesuit province. Now, the House of Representatives of the U.S. government is being counseled by a Jesuit priest of this very same Northwest Jesuit province. Has the United States become Sodom and Gomorrah? Back to my guest, Ken Bitchute from Tamaki Law.
Yeah, just about this conroy that was appointed to be the clergy advisor to the Congress, we were contacted, and we made a comment that no priest from the Jesuit order should be in that position. Their history of sexual abuse, these cases that were filed only goes up to the mid-60s against the Northwest Jesuit order. Do we believe that sexual abuse stopped in 1974 when this mission closed down, or these other missions? The only mission school that's still in operation that was run by the Jesuits is the St. Paul's mission on the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. It's still going. Yep. And but the churches at these sites are still in operation. The thing of it is that we don't believe that sexual abuse ever stopped. The other shoe is going to fall. As these children of abuse in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000, as they grow and mature and get to a point in life where they are going to cognitively begin to deal with what happened to them, and are going to be trying to come forward then. So this victimization, it never stops. We know that. In fact, I went to South Dakota about a year ago, and I started, because there were two Jesuit schools there, one at St. Francis on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. The other was on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and that was Holy Rosary. What we got down there and found out was that these things had been coming out for the past 5 or 6 years, and there were a limited success in networking among the Indian people to bring out the claimants. So I went down there, and I spent 3 weeks. And during that time, I came home with 46 new claimants that we represent in South Dakota now, not only against the Jesuits, but against the diocese who own some of these mission schools down there, as well as the Oblate Society. And it's the same history, exactly identical same history to what happened here in the Northwest, the same sexual abuses of children, the same violence, physical violence, torture of young children. I've talked to so many victims of abuse, and even the worst sexual abuse that can be committed upon a child for years and years, what they're angry about, not only the sexual, but they're so angry because they have these scars over their eyebrows, broken noses, split lips, broken arms and legs, scars on their backs, or whatever from whippings.
Signs of intimidation? Is that the way you see it,
That's
Ken?
exactly what it was. It was
right.
Physical abuse on a level that is unimaginable. And these things were regarded as routine punishment.
Yeah.
Oh, they're just being punished, But when you're whipped so badly that you have scars, lifelong scars on your back, when your ribs are being broken from being kicked by a priest. There's even a couple of victims that had been kicked in the scrotum so hard, they said that their scrotums were like the size of oranges. Couldn't walk, for a period of time, and there was such agony. They were never given medical treatment. None of these children were ever taken to the hospitals or to doctors, because that would expose them for what was happening. Never received medical treatment, except by maybe a nurse or somebody that was on staff at the Indian Missions, and that's as far as it went. These two men that I'm aware of that had this happen to them never had children, and they know. They look back and they know that that's what happened to them.
These priests are not priests; they're hardened criminals.
They are.
Why are they not in penitentiaries?
That was every single victim that I have ever talked to that came forward, the first thing that they wanted to know is, can we put them in jail? Are they going to be charged? And I would have to tell them we can't. The statute of limitations is long expired. this is the only form of justice we can get for you, is to sue them and to make them pay you for the abuses.
This is how important it is. This is how important it is for victims of priest pedophilia to come forward, to put all their fears aside, and to help society correct this matter. They've placed statutes of limitations on criminal prosecution of these priests, which protects the priests from timid claimants.
This is something that...
And obviously the Vatican's not doing anything to correct this matter, other than just make platitudes and continue to move these priests around. It's time for criminal prosecution, and that means the complainants have to come forward.
There should be no statute of limitations for criminal prosecution of pedophiles, of child molesters, of child rapists. There should be no statute of limitations. In fact, there was a legislation that was introduced into Washington here a few months ago, and it failed. It failed to pass. They have an 18-year age limit on coming forward with a 3-year extended period for, statute of limitations for discovery, that discovery period. And it's so narrow, so limited. None of these children, unless they're caught in the act, unless they're suspected of child sexual abuse and somebody that's an adult looks into it and finds out about it, then it's reported. But very rarely, ever, does a victim of child sexual abuse ever go and tell anyone. Yeah. They're told, don't you ever tell your mother. I can harm your mother. I can harm your father.
That's right.
And a priest telling a young child that if you ever say anything, you'll commit a mortal sin and you will burn in hell. And when
that's why these priests don't prey on adults. They prey on children because they're so easily intimidated.
They are,
and
they're so
the priests are in so much control of the young minds of the Roman Catholic people.
Absolutely, that's the thing. They're young minds. They can imagine hell in a way that an adult does not. It's so vivid to them when a priest tells them what hell is and how they're going to suffer if they say anything. They shut their mouth. They don't want to burn in hell. Little children can picture that, and it's a fear. That's a nightmare. And they don't want to have to suffer that. And that's what the priests used on them. It was not only their status as the priest, as the big man, as the all-powerful, the voice of God, the messenger.
Yeah. Right.
No one ever dared. Children never dared to say anything. And when they did, like I said before, they were disbelieved. Or even if they heard what they said and knew it to be true, in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, what could you say against a priest? You wouldn't dare. Yeah. Not Indian people. During those days, there was a great deal of prejudice and discrimination. Indian people were very poor. And, so they had no power against a white man, much less the priest in the community, and who enjoyed such high status. But this isn't about, sexual abuse isn't about sexual gratification. It's not about sex at all. It's about power and control.
Right.
And no parent ever sends their child away to an Indian mission to be sexually abused. They send them there to these schools to be educated, to be cared for, to be fed. And for the very reasons that I said a moment ago about the poverty levels and the isolation of things, and kids had to go to school, that's why they sent them there. That's not what happened, And it's even in these communities today, there's a great deal of pain. But what came with this cycle of this abuse that went on in these Indian missions has become a cycle of abuse in Indian communities to this day, where there's childhood sexual abuse, there's violence, divorce, domestic violence, and it's just a cycle of abuse that came into, and the resulting alcoholism, drug abuse, the trying to escape from feelings or memories and everything else that goes with all of this, to self-medicate from your depression and anxiety. They drink, they drug, and it's a cycle of abuse that began at the Indian mission schools. I can tell you this, every community, any community, reservation that has a mission school or a Catholic Indian school, you can see in the communities the dysfunctionality.
Right.
There were other reservations that didn't have these Indian mission schools where the children weren't taken away, by the dozens and kept for, 12, 13 years, isolated away from their homes and their families, like the Crow Reservation in northern Montana and southeastern Montana and the Cheyenne Reservation. When I visited those communities, they didn't have an Indian mission school on their reservation. And they're smaller. They're more close in, and they're closer to communities that had public schools. They are very strong in their traditions, culture, and their language. Because if you remember, what was the mission at these residential schools? Their mission was to kill the Indian and save the man. This was the last bastion of genocide against the Native American. In the last century, leading to the 20th century, it was estimated that there were 25 million Native Americans that were killed in the expansionism to the West.
Yeah.
At the turn of the century, in the 19th century, there were only 250,000 estimated living Native Americans in this country. We now only number about 2 million.
Yeah.
What was suffered in that 100-year period, 25 million killed, was the worst genocide in the history of mankind against any race or culture. I call it a Holocaust because that's what we all know it to be. I've had people criticize me and say, "Oh no, don't use that term. That's just the Jewish. They were the ones that."
I describe it as a Native American Holocaust. And I'm convinced that if your investigation continues in the Jesuit provinces adjoining the northern tier of states in this country and Canada, you are going to uncover a Holocaust, a sexual Holocaust of Native American people. And I hope God strengthens your efforts and blesses your work, and you can bring this to Inquisition Update and eventually get some mainstream media coverage of this ongoing Holocaust with no end in sight.
You mentioned a little while ago about the power of the Catholic Church and the Jesuits being that military arm of the Vatican.
Right.
You go to Rome and you've got the Vatican here, just a couple of blocks away is the General Curia, which is the Jesuit headquarters in Rome. And they called, of course, the Pope is the white Pope, and then there's the black Pope, who was the Father General of the Jesuits.
Yeah.
And these are the richest orders in the world. They control so much wealth. They control countries. Here, in my investigations, I talked to you once about going to South Dakota, and I started investigating down there. That was in January of last year, 2010. While I was there, I put up some flowers, I put up some flyers, I put up some ads. I started networking in the Indian communities and traveling around to the reservations there. And in March, as a result of my presence there, Steve Smith, who was the attorney for the Sioux Falls Diocese, wrote an amendment to the South Dakota State Statute 261025 was the law for childhood sexual abuse. And in that law, there was no age limit. There was a 3-year statute of limitations from the time of discovery to 3 years to file a claim for childhood sexual abuse. That was the law. And you could hold the diocese accountable. You could hold the school accountable if it was a teacher, some employer accountable if it was one of their people. There was no limits on that. He amended the statute to say that 40 years, age 40 was a cutoff date for coming forward. No monetary damages, and you could only hold the perpetrator of abuse accountable and no one else. No other state has that limitation. And this was just a step back in time.
And this was South Dakota? This was South Dakota?
And this law that was presented in March, it was presented on March 4th to the legislature. It passed on March 8th. It then went to the governor for his signature, and he signed it into law on March 29th. It was a 3-week period. It was just rushed right through. I called it the Midnight Express of going through the legislature to the Senate to the governor of South Dakota, who was Mike Brown, and he signed it into law. It became effective July 1st, 2010. Now, the amazing thing about this, the truly harmful, I mean, not only the law, the cutoff period, with that law, that 40 years of age virtually cuts off all of the victims of childhood sexual abuse that went to the Indian mission schools in South Dakota, because they're all over 40 years of age, the majority of them. And so this law just eliminated the victims' rights to justice in South Dakota. That Steve Smith is the attorney for the diocese who did that, along with Senators Garnos and 2 congressmen, Junke and Dedrick, all Catholics.
Yep.
You know, that came forward and put this through and pushed it through the House.
That's the error. That is the error of having Roman. That is the error of having Roman Catholics in government. In England, in Protestant England, Catholics were forbidden to hold public office for these very reasons. And the error of the United States is to allow Catholicism to continue uncontrolled and unmonitored. There's a built-in safety net that people suffering the sexual abuse of Roman Catholic priests wait to the later years in life to come forward with these horrific stories of priest pedophilia. And the legislation of, did you say North Dakota or South Dakota?
South Dakota.
South Dakota is passing legislation to limit the liability of Roman Catholic priests and priest pedophilia. It's a crime, and we all know that the wheels of government turn extremely slowly, except when they're protecting the rights of these Roman Catholic priests and they're taking away the rights of the American people. Roman Catholicism controls the government, controls the courts, and we've got to put a stop to it, and the only way we can put a stop to it is to take this filthy, disgusting story out from under the covers and give it the shining light of the sun of exposure and put this in the public discourse. The American people cannot continue to be so pious as to allow this atrocity to continue in this country. God is a righteous God, and He will hold us to account for how we handle or don't handle this pedophile priest pandemic, not only in this country, but the rest of the world. It's an outrage, and God is not going to continue to postpone His judgment.
You know, I'd like to tell you something. You know, in my investigations into the Jesuit order and uncovering these priests who were guilty of committing sexual abuse on children, what I discovered is that in the late 1950s, that Cardinal Spellman, this is the cardinal that officiated at JFK's funeral, the most powerful clergy at that time in the United States.
That's right. The American Pope, he was called.
Yes, that's what he was. And he went to St. Ignatius Mission in St. Ignatius, Montana, and he abused children, sexually abused children. This is now becoming, you know, I reported this, I've talked to networking in with other priests, other lawyers in California and in South Dakota, and we're discovering that wherever he went, he committed these abuses on children. And these were all long known about, but no one ever publishes anything about Cardinal Spellman.
Right. Not
the officiator of JFK's funeral, the most powerful cardinal in the United States in his era. You know, a pedophile? Yes. That's exactly what he was. All right, this little boy, he passed away. He was a grown man in his early 60s, but mid-60s, but he passed away. But he gave us his account about Cardinal Spellman. And he was a little altar boy that was always around the Jesuit residents. They kept him around, this little guy. He could speak Latin like a Roman. He understood it, he could speak it, and they would call him, and they would tell him things in Latin. He would do it. I mean, he was like a little sponge, and he just absorbed this, but he also was a witness to sexual abuse and physical violence on the Indian kids that were there. He was even though he was favored by these priests, he was terrified of them. And then, by the time he reached the age of 8, they were sexually abusing him, sodomizing him. But when Cardinal Spellman was there, he was there in the Jesuit residence. He was there when Mother Finbar, who was the nun, the Mother Superior there at St. Ignatius, came and told Cardinal Spellman, any boy or girl of your choosing, I'll bring him to you.
Oh.
You know, they all knew what was going on. They were all part of it.
The police department knew about it too.
Yeah, there were, you know, not only the Jesuit priests who were abusing these children, but the nuns too. At St. Ignatius, Montana, at St. Labray, at these Indian missions in South Dakota, at St. Mary's in Olmec, wherever they had these Jesuit priests, then they had a nun order there. These women were so capable of not only physical violence on young children, but of sexual abuse themselves. You know, there's no limit to what went on at these residential schools.
Yeah.
It was like it was open house for pedophilia. It was just, and you know, and these children will talk about, these are grown people now, but when they were children, they talk about what they witnessed and what they saw. And someone would come in, like this woman named Sister Catherine, who was a Native American that went to St. Ignatius. And she was a good woman. She cared and loved these children. And they started going to her for comfort. And maybe these priests thought these kids are going to start telling them what's going on. They got rid of her. The same thing with a decent priest who would be sent into the community at these residential schools. If he was a good man, if he was not a pedophile, they didn't want him there. They only wanted people there that would either go along with what was being done, or they were part of it.
Yeah.
And that was the atmosphere of these Indian mission schools. The predatory level was across the board. You know, it was unbelievable. These were pedophile paradises, and captive young Indian children with nowhere to go. Many of them were there year round. I can tell you about this one woman who came to me and told me that from the age of 8, when Father Moore started sexually abusing her, until the age of 13 when she left the mission. You know, lifelong, no self-worth, no self-esteem, depression, anxiety, sexual dysfunction, relationship issues. Even though she was married twice and had children, you know, it just dysfunctional on level beyond belief. It was only until she was in her 40s that she was able to go back to school and finally start re-educating herself. But she still had all these fears, you know. No man could invade her space, you know, and she was always alert to that someone thinks that if someone made a comment to her that, oh, I like your hair, or you look nice today. Just recoil in fear, because, you know, this is anything involving a man, you know, would be just so intimidating to her. She didn't want to be noticed. She didn't want to be admired or even thought of in a nice way, because that would trigger sexual abuse.
Yeah.
And, you know, it messed up so many people for decades of their life. And here they are.
Ken, we're coming up on... Ken, we're coming up on the end of the broadcast. I'd like to make a comment or two.
Yes, please.
The Bible tells us what the cause of this is. The Roman Catholic Church is not only the church of mammon, it is the church of idolatry. They have an unnatural affection for idols, and therefore God sends them a divine recompense, an unnatural affection for like sex. And if you want to read about it in God's holy book, open your Bible to Romans chapter 1 and see the root cause of sodomy and pedophilia in this country in God's holy book. Thanks for coming. Ken Bear, Chief Tamaki Law. I'll be in touch with you on the phone. We'll continue our discussions tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.